Today's lesson will review inherited traits and the idea and principles of heredity. Essential questions. Number one, what are inherited traits? And number two, how are traits governed by the genetic material found in the genes within chromosomes in the cell nucleus? All right, let's start by answering the question, what is heredity? Heredity is the transfer of genes from one generation to another generation. In the example provided, parents represent the first generation and the child would represent the second generation. And you can see we're tracking their hair color, hair texture, and eye color as passed on to the offspring in the second generation. So heredity, the transfer of genes, or traits, from one generation to another generation. All right, here's the guy responsible for these ideas, Gregor Mendel. Hopefully you remember him from earlier in the year, but Gregor Mendel is known as the father of modern genetics. He was born in 1822. He was a monk in Austria, and he discovered the basic principles of heredity by experimenting with pea plants. All right, inherited traits. An inherited trait is a characteristic or feature of one organism that are inherited, which means they're passed from parent to offspring. And in humans, this can include some examples: freckles, your eye color, hair color, whether or not you have dimples. In animals, it may be their eye and hair color, their hair texture, face shape. And in plants, and this is what Gregor Mendel was focused on, and what he was studying leaf shape, plant height, flower color. He noticed that different pea plants had different shapes, different colors, and wanted to know why. And through his experiments, he discovered that, and you can see in the examples on the right-hand side there, the seed shape. You could have round or wrinkled seeds. The seed could have different colors, yellow or green. The flowers could even have different colors, purple versus white. The shape of the pods could be different, and the pod color itself could be different. The plants could be tall versus short. All these different things he figured out based on his experience in crossing the plants. Now, how did he figure these out? What's the differences in these traits? It has to do with dominance and recessiveness. First, dominant traits. They are traits that hide other traits when passed on to offspring, which means a dominant trait will show its specific characteristic even when only one parent passes the gene to a child. When a child inherits dominant brown hair gene from dad, the child will have brown hair. Even though the mother in this example on the right has blonde hair, blonde's going to be what we call recessive trait. The brown hair trait, when passed along to the child, covers or shows that trait even with the recessive trait being present. So what is recessive traits? A recessive trait is a trait that gets hidden by dominant traits. It only shows its specific trait when both parents pass the gene to that child for that recessive trait. And when a child inherits recessive blue eye gene from mom and dad, the child will have blue eyes. So we'll look at eye color as a recessive trait. We know light colored or blue eyes are known to be a recessive trait, whereas brown or dark colored eyes are a dominant trait. So you can look at the percentages on your right there. If two parents have blue eyes, then it's a high likelihood, 99% chance, that the child will also have blue eyes. And there's a 1% chance in there with the more rare eye color green, but again, they're both a recessive trait. So those parents, if they have the blue eyes, they must have blue eyes, or the blue eye recessive traits only, to pass on to their offspring. And you can look, if you've got a green and blue, it changes the percentages a little bit. When we get down to a brown-eyed parent and a blue-eyed parent, which brown would be a dominant trait, versus blue being a recessive trait, you end up with a 50-50 shot of the offspring or child having blue eyes or brown eyes. And then when you have two parents with the dominant eye color, there's still a chance that their children can have the recessive eye colors of blue or green. But it's a higher likelihood, right at 75% chance that their offspring will have brown eyes. But just because they have the brown eyes doesn't mean they can't carry the recessive trait in order to pass that along to their offspring. It just means, remember, dominant traits, going back to the slide before, it only takes one parent to pass that along for it to be present in the offspring. Only one dominant trait can express itself, where recessive traits need two. All right, it has to have two parents pass that gene on to the child. All right, if you're at home alone, you may have to go find the mirror to look at yourself, but if you've got a partner, if we were in class, we would find a partner, but stand up, find a partner, or go to the mirror to look at yourself, and use the diagram that's on the right. You may need a scratch sheet of paper and a pencil, but use the diagram to make a list for each of the dominant traits that you possess. And then once you've done that, think about your parents. You may want to go look at them. Think about them though. Think about their features. Which parents did you inherit the dominant trait from? Remember, because it only takes one parent to pass along the dominant gene, whereas if you inherited recessive genes, both of them must have it. So take a minute. It may take you a little longer than a minute, and work through this little exercise. If you need more time, just pause the video here, right here, and come back when you're ready. All right, again, if you need more time, just go ahead and pause. All right, so how are traits passed? How do we inherit traits? When organisms reproduce, the traits are passed from parent to offspring. It all begins in an organism's cells. Cells are the basic building blocks of all living things, and cells contain the body's heredity material and can make copies of themselves. Remember, our cells can copy themselves in mitosis and meiosis, which you'll see in separate videos, but our body cells, they're going to divide through mitosis. The cells responsible for offspring, they're going to divide through meiosis, which will give us whole new combinations of cells and genes to be passed on to offspring. All right, the nucleus, quick review here. The nucleus, we call it or compare it to a small egg-shaped structure. It's inside the cell. It acts like the brain of the cell. It tells every part of the cell how to act and when to do it, what to do, when to do it. It contains chromosomes and the genes, which we'll talk about in a second. And it stores the cell's heredity material, which we call DNA. Chromosomes. All right, chromosomes appear as thread-like structures that are found in the nucleus of a cell, and they contain all DNA. Each chromosome is made of protein and a single molecule of DNA. They come in matching sets of two. You have to have two chromosomes in order for everything to go as planned. And human cell nucleuses or nuclei contain 46 chromosomes or 23 pairs. That's what makes us human, 46 chromosomes, 23 pairs. Other organisms have different numbers of those set chromosomes. That's what makes different species, different organisms different. Humans always have 46 unless there are mutations and things that go wrong in the division process. Half of these chromosomes, half of our 46, come from one parent and half come from the other parent. That's what gives us the variation. The new offsprings will be similar to the parents, but they're different. They're going to have similarities, but they're going to be their own unique organism because they only inherit half of the genetic material or DNA from each parent. DNA. DNA is a molecule that carries the genetic instructions for all living organisms. Everything on Earth that is alive is made up of DNA. It's the basic building block of all life. It is short for deoxyribonucleic acid. It's what it's made up of. Nucleic acids and deoxyribo sugars. DNA contains the specific instructions to make each type of living creature unique. So all DNA is, in its simplest form, the same, but the way it is combined in our cells makes us unique. It makes us unique from other human beings, and it makes us unique from other species on the planet. And DNA also determines how the cells in a body will function. Are we going to be humans? Is it going to be an animal? Is it grass? Is it a tree? That's what the DNA in the cells determines. How that cell will function. And even if we're inside a human body, what type of cell are we? Are we a heart cell, skin cell, brain cell, so on and so forth? So the DNA is really important, but when you really think about it, it's a very simple molecule. All right, genes. As you can see on the right, you can see a little segment or strand of DNA, and that little bitty tiny segment is what we call a gene. So they determine traits. Genes determine our traits. Genes, like I was saying, is a stretch of DNA on a chromosome with instructions for just one single trait. So on one strand of DNA, we're going to have thousands of different genes, so thousands of different instructions for different traits. And we're going to have how many chromosomes? We got 46. So all of those chromosomes are made up of different strands of DNA with different genes on those strands of DNA. So we have multiple thousands of genes inside our cells that tells our cells how to function. So like chromosomes, genes also come in pairs. It takes 2 copies of a gene in order to express a trait. So each parent, each human being has 2 copies of each of their genes, but through reproduction and through meiosis, we're only going to pass on one of those copies of that gene to our offspring. So therefore, the offspring will be a combination of the parent's genes, but unique in their own right because they inherited one gene from each parent. All right, so let's take another break. I'm going to give you a little activity. So stand up, find a partner to work with if you have one. If not, you can do this on your own, but you may need a scratch sheet of paper and your pencil again, but make a little small Venn diagram, set it up like the picture here, and see if you can list the similarities and the differences between genes and DNA. And I'll give you a minute or so to work on this. If you need more time, you can always hit pause right here and pick back up when you've had time to complete the task. We're going to move on. If you need more time, just pause and pick back up when you're ready. All right, once you've created your Venn diagram, use your piece of paper and pencil to see if you can do these 3 simple tasks. Make a list in order from largest to smallest of the 4 cell parts you just learned about without looking. See if you can do it without looking. Number 2, think it through. Which one of the 4, or put them in order, which one is inside the other. So work from smallest up to the largest. And then 3, make a quick sketch in your notebook or on your piece of paper showing this order that the 4 cell parts go in. And I'll give you a little bit of time to work through that, but if you need more, just hit pause right here and come back when you're ready. All right, we're going to move on. If you need more time, just go ahead and hit pause. All right, so quick review of those cell parts. All right, the cell is the biggest of the four, and it contains the nucleus. Inside the nucleus are the chromosomes. Within the chromosomes contain the DNA. That's what they're made up of. And the DNA contains thousands of genes in tiny little segments all along those DNA strands. All right, switch gears for just a second. We've been talking about inherited traits, but let's take a second and talk about another type of trait, an acquired trait. An acquired trait is different from inherited traits. An acquired trait is a physical characteristic of an organism. They are not passed down to the offspring genetically, meaning they're not passed through the genes. You can't inherit an acquired trait. You have to learn a trait or a skill. If you'll look at the examples on the right, skateboarding, shooting a bow and arrow, riding a bike, you don't inherit those skills or those traits. You have to learn them. Those traits are a product of the environment's influence on an organism. Now, that's not to say that you may not inherit, you may inherit a trait that makes it easier for you to learn that skill, or you inherit certain traits that help you do a certain skill better, but they're not, you don't genetically inherit those traits. You have to learn them. An example would be being a good basketball player. You don't inherit that trait from your parents. They may have been good basketball players, but there's no genetic trait, no gene in your DNA for being able to play basketball. But what you may do or may have inherited is a trait for being tall. Now, just because you're tall does not mean you're going to be good at basketball, but it could give you an advantage in learning that skill, if you see what I'm talking about there. So you can inherit certain traits that help you acquire traits better, but an acquired trait is not something you're going to inherit from a parent. All right, let's check for understanding here as we wrap it up. Can you recognize inherited traits? I'll throw in there, can you recognize the difference between inherited traits and acquired traits? And can you explain how genetic material found in genes governs inherited traits?